Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Ask Us Anything webinar, exploring ways the new Trump administration will impact your brand and industry. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, we're inviting you to submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Our plan is to answer your questions at the tail end of today's session. However, if time does run short, then your question will be answered by email. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's moderator, Matt Carmichael, SVP and editor of Ipsos's magazine, What the Future. Matt, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen, and welcome everyone. We have a great panel set up today. We've got Jennifer Bender, who's our Global Head of Trends and Foresight and an Associate Partner within Ipsos Strategy 3. Jason Brown, a Sector Leader within our client organization. Chris Jackson, an SVP in our Ipsos Public Affairs, who heads our public polling practice. And as Ellen mentioned, I'm Matt Carmichael, and I will be your moderator. So I just want to kind of quickly introduce everyone, and we're going to set the stage for the discussion a little bit with some data, because we're Ipsos and that's what we do. And we just want to say kind of from the baseline that everything at the moment is really fluid. There are a lot of different things going on, and those things are already in some cases being challenged in courts. So we're going to have to see kind of how this all goes, but we will do our best for you today. And again, we want to kind of start with a little bit of data about where the public stands today. And thankfully, we've been doing a lot of great polling on all of these issues. So first, we just yesterday released with Reuters a poll about a lot of the different executive orders that have come out in, let's check my notes here, the 8 days we are into this administration. And support for all these various actions varies a little bit. For the most part, a majority of people do not support these various actions, but a lot of them are kind of right in that 40, 45, 50 range. And we're seeing that the president's approval rating is as high as it has ever been, right around 47, 48%. So there's broad support, for instance, for downsizing the federal government. And today he announced a voluntary retirement and buyout plan for all federal employees, more or less. We are seeing that there's pretty broad support for the hiring freeze, requiring federal employees to return to work. But there's less support for some policies like ending birthright citizenship or pardoning the January 6th protesters, which has already happened. And then one area that the Trump administration campaigned heavily on and has promised us as soon as possibly this weekend are tariffs. So there's a lot going on. President Trump is doing exactly what he said he was going to do. He is delivering on most of his campaign promises already in exactly the way he said he was going to, which was with a quick flurry of executive orders in the first few days of his presidency. And public opinion on all of these things matters. As the Wall Street Journal has pointed out, whether or not the Federal Reserve Board resumes its interest rate cuts, in large part is going to be based on how people are thinking about the economy and whether they're worried about inflation. And tariffs can play a part in that. So this is an area we've been doing a lot of polling on and will continue to monitor. We asked kind of a quiz question, and 45% of Americans correctly answered a question about kind of how tariffs work. And that means that 65% don't really understand how tariffs work. So that's important too, is that there's always going to be this kind of educational gap with people and what they understand about what's going on around them. About 28% think that tariffs on goods will lead to more jobs in the US, and about 25% say they're stocking up on things. So while we see that 2/3 of Americans think that tariffs will lead to higher prices and are worried about the inflation there, only a small portion of them are actually doing anything about that in terms of preparing and stocking up on things. Electronics, especially with the proposed tariffs on China, are a big deal. Home improvement, we get a lot of lumber and building materials from Canada, which is another place that President Trump has indicated he wants to be putting tariffs in place. So there are things that people are starting to think about, but we haven't seen huge movements in the marketplace, at least in our data, about people preparing for all of these things. Immigration is another big policy objective for President Trump. We see broad support for doing what the administration is currently doing and really what the Biden administration was already doing, which is deporting immigrants who are here illegally and have criminal records. But from there, we start to see support become very polarized in terms of how people actually want immigration to be carried out. And again, we see a lot of polarization on some of the issues about tariffs and about the way the government kind of functions. And so in the chat linked, you'll see the POV we've put together. It is a 5,000 word opus on how all of these things could impact a lot of different sectors. We kind of go through each one of those. And we talk about a study that we did where we took kind of 7 realms of policy and asked 37 questions right before the inauguration to get kind of a baseline of where the American public is. And we'll go through some of those things now. We tried to kind of game out, based on all of the campaign promises, where policies might start shifting and how those would impact people. So the fact that there's broad support for immigration is kind of belied by the fact that there's almost 1 in 4 people who think they personally know someone who is worried about being deported. So this is one of the stats that comes from the POV. I would recommend checking out the POV where we have all of the data in detail, including a lot of the partisan splits, because a lot of these issues really do have a lot of partisan split behind them. So we took our kind of 9 global trends and we thought about how those trends might be starting to shift as the administration rolls out all its policies. It's interesting thinking about immigration because while we do think that immigration could lead to increased jobs in the US, or tariffs could lead to increased jobs, 44%, including nearly 7 in 10 Democrats, think that we're going to have labor shortages because of the deportations. So a lot of these issues have tensions within them, both not only in terms of things that the various parties and partisans believe, but also within things that we believe things that are kind of in conflict with each other. We'll talk about a couple of those as we go. Today is some of the starts of the confirmation hearings for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. As the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary. A couple of his big policies that he's talked about. One has broad political support, which is that 66% of Americans think that ultra-processed foods are a public health hazard. There's very little public divide on that. But there's also very little public divide that most Americans think that vaccines are an important public health tool, including majorities in both parties. So those are kind of 2 of his things that he has talked about as priorities for his role in the administration. In terms of the government itself, about half of us have had good customer experiences with the federal government in the past year. Things like the post office, passport renewals, the IRS, places where people interact with the government pretty frequently. So that said, there is also, as we talked about, broad support for shrinking the federal government. Democrats are a little more likely to say this, but it's worth noting that very few disagree that they've had a good customer service experience. So with all the proposed staff cuts and the current hiring freeze, which could impact, among other things, seasonal hires in the IRS as we come into tax season, will that kind of positive customer service experience, will that continue to carry forward? And speaking of that, we've got a majority, including a majority in both parties, saying the government should be staffed by employees who remain in their roles regardless of who controls the White House. And again, this is another thing that very few people seem to disagree with. One area that has come up a lot is a lot of the discussion about race and DEI and wokeness within the government and within the nation as a whole. 40% say that they are more likely to purchase something from a company that has taken a public stand against racism. So this is a big area that is tricky for brands to deal with, of course. Dealing with social issues and political ones. Over 60% of Democrats agree with this statement, but only about 1 in 4 Republicans say. However, a majority in both parties say that if a corporation does take a stand on an issue, they should stick by it, even if that means that they're going to make some of their customers unhappy. And basically, no one thinks that the government should penalize companies whose political or social stances it doesn't agree with. So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A, I'm sure, as it's a big topic for brands, especially as in our Global Trends report, we see an increasing majority of people who say that they want to buy products and services from brands that agree with their values. So keeping all of that in mind is going to be an interesting space to be watching through these election times. Education is a pretty benchmark value for Americans. There's high agreement in both parties that the government should prioritize making college more affordable for current and former students. And we see different proposals in the government that could kind of muddy that equation a little bit. One, a lot of funding for educational institutions comes from the National Institute of Health, the NIH, and that's paused a lot of critical research funding. There's also been a proposal that financial aid could become taxable as well as endowments for a lot of private institutions. But there's also a proposal to create a free online university system. And beyond that, education is something that we're all really divided on. We asked a series of questions and there was overwhelming support from the Democrats on those in the POV. And that pushes up slightly a more tepid, but also usually majority Republican support for a lot of different educational things. And again, one of the bedrock values is that most Americans think that education is still a great equalizer. So we've got to keep these kind of core values in mind and the things that we do all agree on. And I think that's something we'll probably be talking about a little bit more in the Q&A as well. And please feel free to start getting those questions in the chat. I see some coming in already. 63% when we think about globalization and our role in the public sphere, especially as we are already seeing, a pretty reasonable amount of support for some of the president's early actions in terms of withdrawing from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Treaty. But most people say that given the economic issues facing the US today, we should be focusing more on ourselves and less on the world around us. However, most also say that it would be best for the future of the country to be engaged in global affairs. So again, we see some of these tensions within people in terms of the things that we agree with, even if those things are slightly in conflict. And the last point I want to make is one I like to kind of try and close a lot of things on, which is that it's always good to keep in mind that about 40% of Americans, and there's no partisan split on this at all, this is not a political issue, this is something that affects both sides of the aisle, is that we're mostly living paycheck to paycheck. So anything that disrupts the economy, anything that disrupts the social safety net can have a big impact. And of course, one of the things could be lower taxes and less regulation and a more positive business climate. So there are a lot of different things at play here. And again, to kick off, we are going to do our best with all of this. We are looking forward to answering your questions. And we want to just again say that a lot of this is fluid and uncertain, both in the courts and in terms of public opinion. And so that said, let's actually start with a question that we got before the webinar started, where someone asked us, and I will kick this one over to Jennifer if we can have the panel join us again. Jennifer, what should brands do to navigate in an era of uncertainty like this, where longstanding policy is being reserved first and decisions are likely to be challenged and flipped? So even as the policies are moving forward, some of them might get rolled back or some of them might be changing. What is a business supposed to do in this world?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's a really good question and one that a lot of our clients are asking. So our strategy team is advising clients and working with a lot of clients to first off get aligned internally and break down the silos. I would say that's number one. Put your risk teams, put your corporate comm teams, your insight teams, your foresight teams, if you have them, get them in a room together, break down those silos, break down those walls of communication so that we're all looking at the same things. And what we've found is that a lot of times the same teams are looking at the same macro forces, the same risk factors, and that we need to be sharing information much more often. Now, that's hard to do when things are changing on an hourly or like daily basis. And so some of our clients are setting up war rooms to be able to share that really in real time, I would say. But I think step one is just getting those teams in conversation with one another and starting to break down those walls. And one of our clients really realized that benefit when they were, looking at the insights team, was able to actually sit down with their risk team and compare notes and data and say, we've got a lot of deep research on some of the things that the risk team was putting together for the board. How does that compare to what the insights team is putting together, and develop that into foresight scenarios and very crisply put that together for their board of directors. So that kind of collaboration, I think, is absolutely crucial. And then I think the second thing that enables, once people are able to really work across those silos, is to really think about scenario planning. And that's something that's been around for a long time, whether you call it wargaming, scenario planning, what have you. Using those inputs and thinking about working with a seasoned facilitator, again, whether that's internally or whether you work with an agency and someone who's well-versed in foresight scenarios and scenario planning, bringing all of those stakeholders together in a room, virtually or physically, and discussing what are the first, second, third order implications of all of these different things changing. What are the triggers or the signals that we need to be on the lookout for? What do we need to have an eye toward tracking? Who's going to be tracking those? And how do we need to have a plan in place that we continue to monitor all of these signals and then update our scenarios as necessary? Because how often we're going to need to track and what those signals are is going to depend on your category. It depends on what is happening in the administration, of course, but that's going to be different for every client and different for every industry. So the risk exposure level really does change depending on your category and depending on the type of business you're in. But no matter what, everyone can benefit from working across those silos and from using techniques that we've used for many, many decades, like scenario planning, like traditional foresight planning, to be able to work together as teams to monitor risk and to plan ahead for what happens in these eventualities.
Absolutely. And as you say, this is going to be something that's different for lots of different industries. And Jason, we have a question which I think I will throw to you, which is very forward or introspective for us, which is, what are the implications for all of this for our industry, for market research? If you're an insights professional, how is this world going to be impacting your day-to-day job?
I think a lot of what Jennifer just said is good advice for insights functions. I have to say that, with all of the activity in the first 8 days, I can't help but think a little bit about how I felt when in the early days of COVID, when there was, so much pitter patter, so much information, hard to separate what you should pay attention to, what you shouldn't. So I'd say to kind of build a little bit on some of Jennifer's ideas, I think it's a good time to dust off the COVID era insights playbook and adapt it to the new situation. For many of our clients, and Jennifer alluded to some of this, the COVID playbook was about establishing really agile ways to assess if the news of the day was a thing or not, to establish trackers or to adapt trackers to understand consumer sentiment and behavior and what is people's path towards whatever their new normalcy is going to be. I don't think this is much less of an uncertain and worrisome thing than COVID was, probably, particularly in the early days. But it's a lot of change, and we don't know what's going to stick and what's not going to stick and what that means for the world. I think additionally, what's different here versus a COVID type playbook is, man, you have to stay on top of what's happening in Washington and what's happening at the state government level in a way that's most companies that I've seen don't do that. So it goes in part to what Jennifer was saying about silo breaking, and the corp rep and the public affairs type folks need to be talking to the insights and brand people, so that those things that are happening in the government are understood in terms of their business implications for decision making. So I think that's absolutely critical, is to have some mechanism for tracking that. And kind of the state of the art with social media doesn't take into account what politicians are doing and saying, doesn't take into account in many cases what news outlets are reporting, what's the media coverage, and how do we use that as a signal to, is this new development a thing or not a thing that we should react to? I think that's a big difference. What else? There are also there are societal things that I think the election and certainly the result unveiled or surfaced. The groups that Trump won that maybe we wouldn't have expected him to win 2 years ago or even a year ago, or where he had improvement, I should maybe say. There's interesting things in the populace, like the shift of young men to becoming more conservative and more religious. And it's kind of opposite if you look at young females. So there's something happening there in the profile of Americans that I think research needs to take into account. And even, there's many different flavors of liberal and conservative, more than this. It's a pretty broad spectrum with a lot of granularity. So I think even asking how do you get a handle in research on a person's ideologies? What are the questions that you ask? And I know for the last year I've talked to a lot of clients about how do we get at this in a way that is factual, fair, and more importantly accurate. So those are some of the things that pop into my head as I think of what Insights needs to focus on a little bit more, given the large amount of uncertainty. I could go on, and I guess maybe the main thing, as always, for Insights is to just be the arbiters of truth and not let organizations stray too far from their North Star based on overreacting to things.
Yeah, and that's a great segue. I mean, you talked about trackers and the importance of those. And I think back to the early days of COVID, where we started our own tracker as a public research idea. And that became so valuable that we haven't stopped it. So our little COVID tracker is about to turn 5 in a couple months. But you kind of segue really nicely into our next question, which I will shoot over to Chris here, that with the election and everything behind it, one of our clients is wondering, has America fundamentally changed, or is it the same America? Is it a new America? Kind of what's going on in the population as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's definitely this sort of feeling that there's this big fundamental change that's happened. And of course, Washington has changed, the administration has changed, and that is large, and that is going to have big impacts and far-reaching impacts and very chaotic impacts, as the first 8 days have shown us. But I think the election does not suggest that there's this big fundamental change in who Americans are and what Americans are believing. We've been at Ipsos tracking for over a decade now what we sort of call sort of the age of populism or an age of uncertainty, where we've been finding large majorities of people in the United States and most countries actually around the world do not have confidence in the institutions of their countries, the government, the courts, the legal systems, the private sector, even to some extent. This isn't new. This is something that's been happening for a long time. It's a long-term change, and the partisanship as well that Jason and Jennifer were both sort of alluding to, also not new. Like the sort of entrenched partisanship in sort of the current form, goes back at least to the early Obama administration and sort of the birth of the sort of anti-Obama sort of movements that happened immediately after the Great Recession. But again, not new. All of these are big, long-running trends that have just sort of converged in this moment to result in Donald Trump's election and what will be a massive change in Washington, but not necessarily a massive change in the country writ large. And I think that's why we're going to see some of these findings, like Matt was showing you at the beginning of the call. Americans actually aren't really voting for huge wholesale change. I mean, they aren't happy with the system. But when you get real down to sort of brass tacks, there is a lot of desire for sort of comfort, for consistency, for people to sort of get the same kinds and qualities of services they've always gotten. So I think the Trump administration's big risk is potentially going too far. They've been very loudly claiming they have a large mandate, which I don't think necessarily is what the election data says. And what people really were voting for was a turn to 2019 prices more than anything else. And Trump has already signaled that his ability to sort of get prices down might be limited. And indeed, many of his policy proposals, folks think are potentially going to go the other, cause prices to go up. So yeah, I do think that we're seeing, this sort of bifurcation of Washington, big change, but American society not really looking for a big change. And one final note I would just like to sort of leave, and it's sort of my little bit of like positive, kumbaya-ness kind of thing, is when you remove the very politicized language from discussions of public policy objectives, the brand, the Republican or Democrat or Trump or Biden or Harris or whomever, and you take it down to sort of very plain language descriptions of what public policies are about, you actually see a lot more unanimity than you would expect, where Americans are actually on the same page. And Matt was sort of alluding to this in his introduction. Americans want a government that provides sort of basic services. They want a system that allows their kids to get a good quality education. They want to feel safe and secure. The real division and partisanship sort of breaks down when you just start attaching the teams and the labels to it. But at a fundamental level, people are actually all kind of looking for the same basic things. And I think that's the place where the private sector potentially, as entities that are delivering these services, actually still has a lot of room to operate and potentially, protect your reputations moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, I'm gonna toss our first audience question in here. That you talked a little bit about trust and how that is changing. And we have a question from a healthcare and life sciences company wondering, how do you build trust in that space as these different institutions are changing, as our kind of relationship with science itself is changing? So what can a brand do in especially that space, but really any space, to continue to keep up their brand trust, even if trust is in institutions broadly is diminishing in some cases?
Yeah, and the first thing, of course, is you should hire the Ipsos corporate reputation team to help you manage your corporate reputation. But beyond that, I think this is a period where trust in institutions is decaying. It's sort of like that's the background noise. So if you think of it as like the tide is rolling out, you got to be swimming upstream to stay in the same place, much less to advance. So you do constantly need to be sort of thinking about your reputation, how your customers or stakeholders trust your organization. And trust is built, like psychological research has shown, sociological research has shown that trust is essentially built through regular, constant interactions that result in a consistent and understandable pattern. So it's not necessarily always good, but it's that people can rely on you to do a certain thing when you interact with them. I think that's the key thing, is that you need to make sure that you're staying close to your customers, to your stakeholders, and that you're providing consistency for them so that they can rely on you to do what they expect you to do, and not necessarily to pivot left, right, left, right, left, right every time something new comes along the way, because that's actually what damages trust as much as anything else.
And if I recall correctly from our trust barometer, I'll come back to you in just a second, Jennifer. Doctors and medical professionals are among the most trusted professions still, and people trust their doctor even more than they trust doctors as a whole. Right. So I think there's probably something there in terms of like our individual relationships with experts are very different from our kind of broad relationships with experts.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that in-person contact, that sort of, the person matters so much right now when everything virtual seems like slightly suspect. Knowing somebody and having that face-to-face interaction actually is even more important in this sort of very virtualized world. I'm sorry, Jennifer, I know you had a thing to jump in.
No, I was going to agree with that to some extent. And I think it depends on the situation, actually. So I would say that you're both right in the sense that the spheres of influence have changed and the spheres of trust have changed. That you're right that the institutional trust has declined, and we're seeing the same thing in our macro forces and our 10-year trends of the Ipsos Global Trends study that we've conducted. But I think what that has been replaced by is, in some cases, brands. So there is an opportunity for brands and corporations to step into that. But the way that you do that, to Chris and Matt's point, can be with individuals. Now, could that be with individuals who are healthcare practitioners, who are individuals who interact on a one-on-one or one-to-small group individual basis? That's one way to do it. But I think, Chris, maybe a counterpoint to what you were saying is that people are also looking for trust in individuals through digital relationships. So I think there's still something to be said. We saw it play out in the election in terms of digital trust and people who feel that they are connected to individuals that they've never met, even if they are, people who are reviewing products, who are influencers online, who are running podcasts. All of that are also forms of trust as well. And I think it underscores how trust has moved from the institution to the individual. Even if you've never met that person face to face, it is moving from that big organization down to the individual. So I would think about that as an organization. What are all of the different spheres of trust that you can potentially influence, and all of the different levers that you can pull? And it may be that you need to rethink your strategy in terms of communications, marketing, channels, but it's certainly something that you still have an impact on, and that you have areas where you can move the needle and pull those levers.
It's also
Yeah.
interesting from a retail sector perspective for companies, any companies that have a frontline staff that's interacting with consumers. What is their remit, to your point about channels, Jennifer? What is their remit in terms of establishing closeness between the brand and the consumer? What is their role in reading the room in terms of why consumers are doing what they're doing and feeding that back into the organization? You know, I think most employee research is about customer complaint reporting or are you happy as an employee of this company? And there's probably a lot more that could be done with employees to understand the evolving kind of how consumers are acting, what they're doing, what they're thinking. And that has the mutual benefit of, you know, creating empathy between us, the brand, and the customer, but it also is a vehicle for intelligence to make smarter decisions.
Yeah. And so we've talked a lot today about uncertainty, but Chris, is there also some predictability to what the new administration will do?
I mean, that's a big question, and that's a tough question, and I think one that anyone who has an accurate answer is probably going to make a bunch of money off of. I don't think that there's perfect predictability in what this administration is going to do, because it, more than any other recent administration, except for the last one, like this, is really driven by sort of one guy's views on the world. It is more sort of personality driven than most presidential administrations in our history have been. That being said, there are some pretty consistent patterns. One is that things will be done with sort of an eye towards what the president's voting base is interested in or prioritizes. So that's 20 or so % of the country who sort of identify as strong Republicans or MAGA Republicans. He's been pretty consistent about sort of catering to things that population is very interested in, and has been reluctant to do things that population is opposed to do. One of the other trends, though, I think that's just important to keep in mind is that this is an administration that believes in flooding the zone. So even if your brand or your company does become the target of something, it probably won't necessarily last that long, because some other outrage will come along tomorrow or the next day or the day after that to sort of pull coverage. So a lot of what you'll need to plan for is getting through the immediate moment. And I think that's why you have to have a lot of the stuff Jennifer was talking about, of planning ahead, having your channels open, your communications plans ready, your war room set up. But you don't necessarily have to worry about a sustained focus on your brand, because that's just not how the administration is working at the moment. Now that doesn't mean that policy changes will have a long-running effect, and we're still seeing how that rolls out. As Matt was saying, lots of the new policies getting challenged in court, so it's a bit messy, and you should talk to your government affairs people about exactly how that's rolling out. But I do think, the MAGA base understanding sort of what their priorities are, and then just being, prepared to sort of deal with it for a period of time when something happens. And in that period, trying to stay as close to your customers and your stakeholders as possible to weather the storm.
Anyone else want to dive in on that one? Or we're getting a bunch of questions in the chat with similar themes of what does this mean for my sector, including both the auto and kind of CPG implications. Jason, you want to take that one about what you're seeing and hearing from clients?
I think tariffs are probably most top of mind, and you mentioned they may be imminent. And economists some will say they don't work, some will say that it depends, and there are winners and losers. One thing I know Ipsos knows, and it was in one of the slides that you had up there, Matt, that most consumers are wanting lower prices, most consumers don't know what tariffs are, how they work, what they do. So the kind of only empirical evidence to consumers around tariffs, for instance, I'll talk about some other things, I think, is if their prices are lower empirically. That'll be the only evidence that they're working. I think in the automotive sector, in all sectors, obviously tariffs will help companies that have strong domestic supply chains, strong domestic production capabilities, and that's true of any sector. For the auto sector, does it mean an increase in prices to consumers? Maybe. I think this whole stew that's cooking of DOGE activities to reduce government costs and a generally more favorable business environment for automotive, generally less pressure around electrification. Some of those costs of keeping up with regulations, electrification costs, some of those costs will potentially be offsets to whatever tariffs do. Can't predict the future, but in automotive, I don't think certainly for US automakers or for strong US production automakers like Toyota, for instance, I don't think the sky is necessarily falling. I don't think it necessarily needs to equate that car prices are going to go up by XYZ. For CPG, I think Make America Healthy Again is something that needs to be watched. It's not, these things aren't new. You could see them coming. But I think the kind of priorities for more healthy ingredients is a key thing. I think tariffs, if there's not a strong US supply chain, then you have to be watching reducing costs and watching your price elasticity pretty closely in the CPG sector. But automotive, I think, has some interesting interplay. And CPG is probably a little harder to predict how that's going to play out.
Yeah, I saw a comment from I think it was a Democratic congressman from Maine about tariffs and imports and foods especially, and he was talking about, avocados are great, but do we really need to eat them year round? And I think my kids would absolutely say, like, yes, we do. So I think there, as you say, like, depending on the supply chain and where things are grown, I think there are a lot of different ways that could all play out.
Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about kind of division and touched a little bit on the things that keep us together. But Jennifer, we've got a question about, with a public that is so divided on like everything, and all of the kind of things we're seeing that don't necessarily seem like political topics necessarily, like EVs or alternative proteins, becoming political anyway. Is there a safe space for brands to take a stand and show us their values that are the kinds of things that consumers want to align their values to?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because that's come up so many times with clients recently where we'll be talking about a topic and talking about, how trends are evolving and even, from the client side, as they're looking at risk, oftentimes they're looking at things even further ahead in terms of the political environment and where they're starting to see early warning signs of regulation that's going to impact their particular category. And I think it is becoming much more concerning in terms of like litigation and potential regulation that's creeping into more spaces. And I think you're right to say that it does feel like there's no quote unquote safe space anymore. And a lot of this is driven not only by politics, I would say, but to the point that we were making earlier, it's part of long-term trends that we've started to see, macro forces that have been driven oftentimes by technology. I'll be honest that, if you think about 10, 15, 20 years ago, how we communicated with one another, very just wildly different from how we communicate now. And so technology is a big part of why this is happening in terms of the division that we're seeing. We now have the opportunity to seek out the information and seek out the opinions that more align with our own. And part of that is, just the nature of social media and technology. A, you have a choice, but B, the platforms that we're using are built to feed us things that we like. They're built to help us, but in some cases they're not necessarily helping us. And so I think setting aside misinformation and true disinformation, I think, looking ahead, the echo chamber isn't going to go away anytime soon. Political division, partisanship, that's not going to go away anytime soon. And so this long-term trend that Chris was talking about earlier, that's not going to change. And that's part of the reason that we highlighted in our global trend study, Splintered Society. It's something that's been building over many, many years, and it feels like it's at a crescendo, and I think it is. But that doesn't mean, to Chris's earlier point, that brands can't take a stand. In some cases, there are things that we can actually agree on, and it might be that we need to be really careful about how we talk about them and avoiding kind of flashpoint terminology and figuring out what is that common thing that we value as a society, that we value as a people, or that the majority of your consumers can agree on. And I think that depends on your brand. It depends on your position in the market. It depends on your category, because there are some things that, an auto manufacturer shouldn't be taking a stand on. It doesn't make sense. Versus a clothing manufacturer, maybe it does. So it's wildly different depending on your category. But you have to take a hard look at your customer strategy. What is your brand purpose? What do you really stand for? What's true to your core brand purpose? What makes sense for that? And then thinking about taking a step back. Where is demographic change going? Are you serving the type of customers that are going to be around in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? So again, putting that kind of futures mindset on, putting that foresight mind hat on, and thinking about, is this something that's going to serve us long term? And I think that's a really tough thing for brands to be able to grapple with internally. Is it better to kind of stay the middle road and not make any waves and not take a stand on tough issues? Or is it something that we are going to have to take a stand on a particular issue, or we're being kind of backed into a corner where we do need to make a stand, and we may lose some people in the process? Is it better to lose some people now and align your brand with a growing audience, or with something that's really true to who we are as a brand and our brand strategy and our brand purpose? What are those trade-offs and what are those risks? So I think it's not an easy answer for brands, but it's something that brands really do have to, look inside themselves, inside their leadership, their organization, and think about all of those different permutations and the factors that go into it, from the strategic side of, the category that you're operating in, the future of what demand looks like for your category, the future of your consumers, all of the risks that we were talking about in terms of the political environment. A whole lot of factors are going into influencing choice. And then at the end of the day, we were talking about the economic environment earlier. Even if it's something that people are passionate about, we have to be realistic. People are still struggling. They do want prices to come down, and that's realistically not going to happen in a lot of categories. So even if people do feel passionate about a topic, you can make the best, strongest stance, for example, on sustainability, and it may not change the needle in terms of what people choose at checkout, because they're grappling with things like affordability. They're grappling with things like making ends meet. So it's a tough situation, and I think it's going to be a different answer for every brand, but taking all of those different pieces of the strategy into account is really the right way to answer that. Chris, Jason, I don't know if you would add anything to that in terms of how to navigate those kind of tricky questions.
No, though, thank you for bringing that up, because I do want to amend my answer earlier about what the election signified. And I do think there are these big long-term trends, but Jennifer was absolutely right that one of the big changes we're seeing is how people are consuming information, how people are getting news, media, all the rest of that. And that is rapidly evolving. I mean, even 2016 in Trump's first election, the landscape was vastly different. So that is a big difference, and that's something that you absolutely have to keep in mind. And the one sort of thing I would then add to build off of that is understanding the meaning of your language, because even though theoretically we're all speaking the same language, the interpretations of it are vastly different based on what particular silo you're getting your information from. So we're seeing right now a fight or a debate over DEI, with the administration sort of coming down hard trying to stamp out DEI programs. But what the administration and the administration supporters mean by DEI and what DEI supporters mean by DEI aren't the same things. They're not even really having the same debate in some ways. So I think it's really important as you're preparing your plans, as you're setting up the war rooms Jennifer was advising you to earlier, to think through the language that you're putting together to do that, and make sure that you're not saying something that's going to be interpreted differently by someone else and accidentally step on a landmine. Because increasingly, because of the news silos and the information silos driven by technology, people are not interpreting everything the same way, and then we're living in this sort of reality that has very different meanings for people based on sort of what side they're on.
Yeah, obviously there's a lot in those answers. And one thing I would say, of course, as the editor of What the Future Is, we just had an issue on the power of influence and the future of influence and how all of these opinions are going to be shaped. And we're seeing a lot of the zone kind of being flooded with information and misinformation and disinformation. And there's a lot of just straight up news happening at the moment too. So how that news gets interpreted and the language we see around it. But also bring it back to global trends, where if we look through the data, even the US data, there are an awful lot of, and the global trend study is a lot of basic values statements. And a lot of them have 70, 80% agreement across 50 markets that we surveyed, and even within the US. So there are a lot of these kind of values that are in common. And I think that's probably a good point to end on as we hit our 45-minute mark. So if we didn't get to your question, we're sorry, but we will come back and we will follow up with you directly. Our emails are all on screen, so if you have more questions, please let us know. We'll be sharing a recording as well. And again, a lot of these orders are already in the courts. A lot of things might shift opinions. Please sign up for our newsletters. We will be tracking public opinion on all of this and its implications. And we'll be providing as much of that information as we can. It's a great time to be staying close to your customers and to your audiences. So on behalf of the panel, thank you to Jennifer and Jason and Chris, and thank you all for joining us. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be doing our best to keep up with all of this, as you will be as well. Thanks, everybody.